and welcome to another special episode. Last time we ended our special episode, we were swapping CPU coolers from our old Windows 10 gaming machine, which was originally our Windows 7 gaming machine, to our Windows XP gaming machine. We were moving the much larger, much better, this giant gaming cooler from the old gaming PC, which I downgraded to just a normal workstation and doesn't need a super massive cooler like that, to the Windows XP gaming machine, which clearly does need it because the Core 2 Extreme processor that I was going to use runs extremely hot, and the Core 2 quad processor that I was also using ran very hot. So we installed the cooler, if you remember from the last episode, got everything in, powered up the machine, it started to post, rebooted, started to post, and then went dead, and then on the board we received the dreaded FF postcode, which is fault found, and that's where that video ended. After that I did a lot of off-camera troubleshooting, tried different memory, different processors. I went to a regular Core 2 Duo processor. Board still wouldn't post. I pulled everything apart. Clean connectors, still wouldn't post. Pulled everything off the board. CMOS battery, the BIOS chip came out, memory came out, processor came out. Just used the bare motherboard, still wouldn't post. So I did some looking online, and it's common with these boards that any slightest little thing will either blow out or short the north bridge or the south bridge. I inspected the board thoroughly, both front and back, around the north bridge, south bridge area. I didn't see anything indicative of a very visible short, no scorching, no charring, nothing blown out around them. Checked all the capacitors around the board, couldn't find any of them that were blown, and that. So I went online and I was lucky enough to find a replacement board that I picked up. It came in today, so I figured I would do a rebuild video that I wanted to do initially when everything came in, that I was unable to because I used the wrong camera. So I'm using this, what I used to film the last episodes with. So we're going to go through the build. There's a couple slight changes from the last spec video that I did, that presentation, so I'm going to go through them right now. Everything else will stay the same in the build except for what I'm going to mention now, which is the processor. I'm also being that Windows XP does not, I know this from working in the computer industry and doing many replacement parts on Windows XP machines, they do not like when you replace prime hardware, motherboards, onboard cards, and that. They get specifically motherboards because it doesn't have the right drivers, and XP wasn't smart enough to go, hey, let me reach out online and see if I can find the drivers like Windows 7 was. Windows 10, most of the drivers are already built into Windows 10, so it's not really necessary, though I always do, to run the driver disk that comes with your hardware when you install something on Windows 10, because you'll use the Microsoft Windows drivers, which 9 out of 10 times works, but it's always good to install the manufacturer drivers. That way the product is guaranteed to perform the way it's supposed to perform. So we will be doing a complete reinstall of everything, which for my default gaming channel, which this will air on, means that all the progress that we made in Fallout 1 will basically end where we end with the last 2 episodes. But next year I am going to do another complete playthrough of it from start to finish, and actually somewhat follow an outline instead of just jumping into it and trying to muddle my way through, because there are things that we missed that we need to complete the game that are now difficult to get now that we've already passed that stuff. But that's all for another video. Let's get into this build. So the thing that is going to change in this is the processor. I will not be using the Intel Core 2 Extreme processor, at least for this build, because I don't know if that processor shorted out the board. I have to do a little more testing on it, or if it was just, it could have blown out the north bridge, south bridge, or shorted out the board if I had just turned it on to play a game. I don't know the variables in it, so I'm going to quarantine that process until I can do a little more testing on it. I don't think it is, because when I dropped it in the machine that I pulled the Core 2 Duo processor out of, I got the BIOS notice saying that that particular board doesn't support that processor. So the board sees the processor. I don't think it is, but I need to do further testing on it. So I'm going to go through the specs of that quickly so we can compare it to the processor that we will be using. Alright, so for the Core 2 Extreme, the QX6850, its build name was Kentsfield. It's a quad-core processor, has a base frequency of 3.0 gigahertz, thermal design power of 130 watts. It is a very warm, hot processor. It has an L2 cache of 8,192 kilobytes, a max operating temperature, or its listed max temp from Intel, is 64.5 Celsius or 148.1 degrees Fahrenheit, which at idle, that Core 2 Extreme with the cheap little CPU cooler I was using was running around 150 or 160 degrees Fahrenheit, so it was already running too hot. And the introduction date of that processor was July 16, 2007. So now the processor that we will be using actually came with the new board, and to eliminate any issues of moving stuff around, I'm just going to leave it in the board. It is an Intel Core 2 Quad, similar to the one that we were running, but it's the Q9650, which is slightly newer than the Q6600, I believe, that was originally in the other board. This processor name its design name was the Yorkfield. Again, it is a quad-core processor. It has a base frequency of 3 gigahertz. It has a thermal design power of 95 watts, which makes it a significantly cooler running processor, which is good for us. It has more L2 cache than the other one at 12,288 kilobytes, and it has a higher max temperature of 71.4 degrees Celsius or 160.52 degrees Fahrenheit, and it was introduced August 10th of 2008, so it's a slightly newer processor. It's got slightly more L2 cache. Its thermal power is lower, which means it can run a little warmer, but it shouldn't be an issue with the giant gaming CPU cooler. The board again is still an EVGA NVIDIA Enforce 780i SLI board, so it's the same identical board. We're using the same Western Digital Velociraptor 10,000 RPM hard drives, which I will format out when I install the new operating system. We are still using the same Corsair Gaming 2 gigabyte memory, 2 1 gig chips, and we will still be using the EVGA NVIDIA GeForce, which, let's see, what is it? The EVGA 8800 GTS graphics cards. We'll still be using them. Using the same case, same 1000 watt power supply, same LG DVD burner, and I think that's it. So without further ado, I'm going to move the case off, and we're going to put the new board up. We're going to install the CPU cooler onto it. We're going to install the memory into it, and then we are going to install it into the case and do our cable routing and install all our other graphics cards, audio cards, everything else we'll install. Alright, as you can see, we've got the same board. It's the EVGA NVIDIA Enforce 780i SLI board. It's already got the processor installed. We went through that earlier. I'm not going to touch it, take it out. I'm just going to leave that one in there. I've already installed the backing plate for the cooler. As you can see, I've also wrapped it in electrical tape. It's made out of non-conductive plastic. I tested it, but I want to rule everything out, so I wrapped it in electrical tape, and I also made sure I notched this corner so that it fit past this screw. So with the backing plate installed, we can install the 4 standoff screws, tighten them down, and then we will work on putting thermal paste on, installing the cooler, and securing it down with the 4 nuts and our 3/8 wrench. So these standoffs just screw into the backing plate that we did, and we'll give them a little bit of a tighten so that they don't spin when we tighten the nuts down on it. They don't reach all the way down to the board, so there is wiggle room between the backing plate and the bottom of the standoffs. That way you can't over tighten it and crush the board, which could also damage any of the circuitry in the board and cause the board to not work anymore. And looking at these, there's no up or down right way. The screw length on both sides is the same. They have the same little bump out between the screw. So now we're just going to take our 3/8 wrench and give everything a little tighten. The cooler did come with its own wrench. I misplaced it, but any wrench will do as long as it's the correct size and you are careful. Okay. The standoff secured in place. We'll add a dollop of our thermal paste and install the cooler. Now I've got the fan set on this to pull air in from inside the case. This fan is set same way, so airflow through this is this way. Looking at the board, this will be the back of the case. I want all the hot air to come out of the case, so our orientation for the cooler will be in this direction. Always want to make sure your fans are blowing the air in the direction that you want to remove the warm air from the case or from around whatever device you have. Alright, so with the cooler set in place, we'll take the 4 nuts and we will tighten them down. I always install them, all 4 of them, finger tight, roughly finger tight first, that way everything's even, and then we'll tighten them down fully in a star pattern so it comes down equally. We don't want to over tighten one side or another. We want everything to come down nice and tight equally. And some of these are a little tight to get to, so we'll use our little handy dandy needle nose pliers to line the screw up. And it'll sit just so that I can easily spin it down with one finger. Okay, and then I will evenly turn, 3 or 4 turns on this corner, same on this corner, you know, this corner, and then keep doing that until they're all tight and snug. Again, you don't want to over tight them, but you don't tighten them, but you also don't want them too loose. Alright, so that's 4 turns on that one. Turns on that one. That one I had already down a little too far to begin with. Also helps if you have them all down the same depth when you finger tighten them. That will make up the slack with this one. On snug, and then we'll work on the other 2 corners. Alright, and with that, our CPU cooler is on. Next we will move into installing the memory, which it looks like, being that we're covering up slot 1 or slot 0, we're going to use slots 3 and 4 to install the memory so we don't run into interference, which you can do as long as they're color coded. I got 2 gray slots, 2 black slots. You can either use 2 in the gray or 2 in the black. So we'll use the 2 black slots to install our memory, and then we will drop this down on into the case and continue our build. Alright, as I said, our next step in this process is installing our memory, which we will be installing our 2 1 gig Corsair gaming chips, and as I said, we will be installing them into the 2 open slots 3 and 4, or actually it's slots 2 and 3 and 4. Everything changes in numbering. I don't remember if this is numbered 0, 1, 2, 3, or if this is 1, 2, 3, 4. But in either case, we want to make sure we install them correctly in the correct slots. Luckily, they're color coded because it supports the dual channel memory. Push them in so you get the distinctive click that they're locked in place. Alright, and I always check to make sure that they're all in. Alright, now the memory is installed. Before we drop it into the case, which is our next step, I am going to connect the CPU cooler fans to the header, being that it is at the top of the motherboard and will be pretty difficult to get to once it's already in. And being that we've got 2 fans, we will need the adapter that goes from the 2 fans into the 1 header port. And I'm also going to install the RGB controller cable, as it is also on this side. So what you do is you take your fan connector and you plug it into an adapter. They're keyed so they only fit one way. Okay, and before we go further, we're going to connect again the two plugs. They're keyed with these so they can only go in one way. Go. So we're not going to worry so much about the RGB controller cables just yet, so I'm going to slide them up and out of the way. These are our fan controller cables, and we're going to want to make sure that we run them out of the way so we can secure them, and we will slide the plug onto the header. Alright. Make sure that everything's seated nice and tight, nice and neat. And we'll run them out the same way. We'll secure everything on that side of the board. And we're in. Alright, I believe we are ready to go into the case. So I'm going to slide this off to the side, bring the case back up on the table, and we'll go through the install. Alright, as you can see, I've removed pretty much everything from the case except for the fans across the top, the DVD drive, the fan in the front. I've removed the fan in the back, and we will be installing the new backing plate that came with this board. Even though the boards are identical, this backing plate actually has the EVGA logo on it, whereas the other one was just a plain silver. This has also got the soft cushioning on the back to help stop vibration. This one does not. So you take it, your orientation is going to be the mouse and keyboard port's going to be at the top, your USB Ethernet's at the bottom, so it's going to go in this way, and it just snaps into place in the cutout in the case. Sometimes they're difficult to get in. That one was not too troublesome. Alright, next step is to carefully lift the motherboard and that setup up and into the case, and we'll secure it to the stanchions, which may be hard to see, but there's 1, 2, 3 across the top, 3 in the middle, 1 around the graphics card here at the back, and then 3 across the bottom. Make sure we have all our screws. 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. 1, 2, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. 10 screws. And we're gonna, most of the screws for the computers are gonna be Phillips. So I've got an assortment of Phillips head screwdrivers that we're gonna have to use to get the screws in, because there will be some tight corners to get into, specifically around the top. Alright, on some cases, or depending on the power supply you have, this also might be a good time to plug in the 8-pin power connector for the CPU up in this corner. Unfortunately, the power supply that I have is only semi-modular, and that is not one of the cables that is modular. So we'll have to see how our space is. I should be able to get into that space before I put the fan in. So now we're going to line up our board with our backing plate and looking to line up our holes for the screws. And what I always do is I try to put two opposite corners in to kind of hold the board square. while we make our estimate. It just helps us be able to put all the other screws in easily without having to maneuver the board. So I'm going to do that corner and this bottom one. And again, you don't want to over tighten these screws. You want to run them down until they are just snug. Actually, that alright. Okay, and now it doesn't matter what order you put the screws in, as long as you make sure you don't miss one. These are important. These are the grounding points for the motherboard to the case. Though missing one shouldn't affect anything, you don't never want to take the chance of shorting out a board or having any other electrical issues with the board. So it's always, always, always recommended to install every screw possible. And generally the screws used for the motherboard look kind of like, might be hard to see, but they've kind of got a flat pan-like head to them. I call them the ones with the hats because it looks like they're wearing a hat when you look at them from the side. Because you'll have them, they're easily distinguishable from the hex head ones, which look like this. And these are generally used to install the add-on cards, power supply, and such. And then there's even smaller ones that are usually used, or generally used, to install hard drives and optical disk drives. In most cases, they also have different threading, so if you can't get a screw to easily thread into place, you're probably using the wrong one. And I would suggest looking and trying another screw until you find one that actually should thread in nice and easy until you get them all the way down flush, and then give them a slight turn to snug them up. Alright, so now we've got two left, one in this corner and I think one here. So we're going to have to get a little creative. To get them in, which what I usually do is I'll take a piece of tape, break off a small piece, put it on the end of the screwdriver to help hold the screw, to make the screwdriver head slightly bigger but still malleable to get the screw to stick on. Unless, of course, you've got a magnetic screwdriver, which I don't. And that didn't work as planned. Generally, you can force the screw on, and it'll usually hold it in place, usually long enough for you to get the screw into where you need it to be and secure it down. Take the tape off and make sure it is fully secured down. Alright, one screw left, which is that tight little corner. Get a fresh piece of tape. Alright, we got the screw in place, but we don't want to screw it in crooked. Actually, I need some light. Alright. So our motherboard is now secure into our case. Next step is I'm going to do some wire cleanup off camera to kind of clean up these wires to make everything neat, and secure this one, and then we'll come back. When we come back, we'll work on installing this fan up here, and then we'll move on to installing the power supply, graphics card, audio card, and we'll finish up with installing the hard drives, making sure all the connections are seated correctly and that, and then we will get into powering it up for the first time and installing Windows XP. Alright, we are ready to install our exhaust fan at the back, which will also help pull, being this fan pulling air in, this fan's pulling air this way, and this fan will pull the air out of the case so we get optimal airflow all the way through the case here. These two top fans here are exhausting out the top, and the third fan that I've got up here is pulling air in, along with the fan in the front pulling air in. Some fans have an arrow on them indicating, like this one does, might be hard to see, but you see the arrows indicating the one going to the side is the direction the fan spins, the one that is vertical will show the direction that the air flows in. So this is pulling air in this way, blowing air out. So we want to make sure we install the fan in this orientation. And we'll install it with the cable towards the bottom, and we will set it in place and secure it with for the fan screws. The fan screws look much different than any other screw. They've got a very thick, coarse threading on them. So these, you can't mistake fan screws for anything else. They don't fit in anything else other than fans. And what you do is you just line up the fan with the hole and thread the screw in. Make sure your screwdriver's in the right direction. And again, with everything, I'll do one corner, and then I'll line up and secure the opposite corner. Tighten them all the way down to their snug. Again, you don't want to over tighten these, because they are threading into the plastic of the fan, and you'll just strip out anything and then they won't be held in securely. So you just want to go until you feel a little resistance and then give it a little bit more of a turn to make sure it is secure. Alright. And then for this fan, this particular board's got multiple fan headers. There's 2 down here. Well, there's 3 across the bottom. 1, 2, 3. There's 1 here. There's the CPU fan one, which takes care of the CPU. And I think that's it. So this board's got 1, 2, 3. It's got 4 extra fan headers. So we're going to be using 1 for the back fan, 1 for the front fan, 1 for one of the top fans, and the other 2 don't have a long enough cord, so we will be using a Molex to the fan connector adapter to plug those ones in. But we're going to hold off on that for the moment, and we are going to install our power supply. There's our next major component to get in there, so then we can start routing wires and getting everything into place to connect everything finally before we do our test. So right here I've got our power supply. As I went through in the description, I went with a Roswell 1000 watt power supply, semi-modular. So our main connectors for graphics, motherboard, and CPU power are still hardlined into the power supply, but all our accessories, SATA, hard drive, and if we needed more than what we have for PCIe, we've got additional spots for them here. Fan in the bottom, I always install the fan to the bottom, because in this particular case, there's a screen vent for an inlet at the bottom. Some cases have that, some don't. Some cases have the power supply at the top, and in that case you still want it in the orientation with the fan down. That way it pulls, it also helps move air throughout the case. This one, in this orientation at the bottom, it just cools the internals of the power supply. But it just slides in like so. And then it is secured with 4 of the hex head screws in the back. This one you may have to play with a little bit to get the screw holes to line up, because not all of them sit so that they sit flush at the bottom or against the back of the case, so you may have to get it so you can get at least one screw in to help hold it up while you get the other ones in. Sometimes these can be tricky, especially doing them in this orientation. But usually once you get at least one in, all the other holes will line up, so you can easily thread the remaining screws into place and then tighten them again opposite to opposite, so everything sits flush, gets pulled in flush. Tighten the bottom one in. That one, and finally the lower one. Might not be able to see, it's right. Get my flashlight out again. Goes in down here. Screw, 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 screw. Sure they're all nice and secure in. Alright. Again, I'm going to do some cable routing off camera. It's easier to do that way, and I'll be sure to show you how I route all the cables before we close everything up, and make our final preparations. And when we come back, we will install the graphics cards and the sound card, and then we will work on installing the hard drives, double checking all our connections are made from front panel. All the front panel connections are made, all power connections are made, everything's tight and secure, and then we will install Windows XP. So I'll see you guys back in a few. Alright, so I've made some cable connections as well as doing the cable management. I've connected our HD audio down here. I've made our front panel connections here, 2 fan connections here, fan connection there, our 24-pin power, and I've also made the connection down here of our 8-pin power for the CPU. You can see some cable management there. I've routed some of the extra cables out of the way so I can lay it flat. And now we're going to work on installing graphics cards and the audio card, and then running the cables for them, and then installing the hard drives and running the cables for them. Final touches on all cable management, making sure everything's nice and neat, and then we will work on powering this up and installing our new copy of Windows XP on it. And that will be done. I'll go through off camera once that's done, installing all the drivers, making sure everything's all up nice, happy, and then I may do a video while we're on it, while I do a benchmark, see how things progress, and then get started on the long, difficult task of reinstalling all our games. So let me get the camera back up in the mount, up on my tripod. Alright, so when we're installing the graphics cards, I am going to work from the bottom up. That way if I have to take a card out, it's easy enough, being that the little release clips are on the top. We will be running 2 graphics cards in SLI, so I've got the SLI cable here. And we'll start with this graphics card. Doesn't matter which order they go in. They're not set master slave, so I'm just going to insert this one into the lower slot for the graphics card, being sure not to pinch any cables that are here. What you do is you line up the slot, you line up your back panel too, and then you line up the PCI slot, in this case PCI 16, and then you slide it down until you hear a distinctive snap. I heard the snap, you may not have heard it on there, but you can give it a little tug to make sure that it is secured in place. Next card to go in is our Sound Blaster Audigy sound card. Goes right on the next slot up from the graphics card. Slide that in place till we get a nice click. And we can start putting the screws in to secure them. I don't foresee an issue of having to take them out again. So what we'll do is we'll secure the graphics cards. Usually have 2 screws. I always put both in, just because they tend to be, when the computer's standing up, heavy on this end, especially modern ones. And 2 screws just gives you a little bit more reinforcement to help hold it up. Run them down nice and tight. And then we will secure the sound card. Now on the last build I was having some difficulty getting the sound card to work, so I was actually using the onboard sound for most of it. Don't know if it was a PCIe slot problem or if my card here has actually given up the ghost. But I guess we will see in this build. Alright, now we've got the last video card to put in. Which will go in the top slot. We won't be using the middle green slot, we'll be just using this top one. And again, identical sister cards. It's always the best way to do it. Slide that into place. So it snaps. And we'll secure it with 2 screws. This particular board is capable of 3-way SLI. Pretty much if you're going to do it that way with this board, with this particular case here, that's all you're going to have is 3 cards, and it's going to be an extremely tight fit, and I don't really see too much airflow between the cards doing it that way unless they are liquid cooled, which was just starting to come into being when about these parts were. I've looked online to look at maybe getting a water cooler for the graphics cards if I was doing a full water cooled system, and I can't find one anymore. I do know that they made them for these 8800s, but I can't find them nowadays. Alright, we'll double check to make sure all our screws are secure. And we will install our SLI cable now, which these cards only have 1 SLI slot. Modern cards will have 2, so I'm not quite sure how the 3-way SLI worked with them. But maybe not these cards were capable of it, maybe there were other cards that were capable of the 3-way SLI, but not worried about it. We're not using 3-way. We are just using 2 cards in standard SLI. Last thing we have to do is I gotta route the power cable here for the 2 cards correctly, and then we will be pretty much done installing all the major stuff. Pull those cables back out. See, okay, these particular cards have their power connectors at the back, which is nice. Some of the modern ones have them here on the side, and these are only 6-pin connectors, so we won't be using the extra 2. So we'll tuck them out of the way, slide in until we get the click. Alright, make sure that they're out of the way of fans and that. Alright, graphics cards are in, SLI is connected, power is connected. Last thing to do is to run the SATA cables for the hard drives, install the hard drives, and then I've got a few extra power cables I need to install. For SATA power for the hard drives, and the Molex power for the RGB controller, and the extra fan connector. I'm going to run the cables in that offline. I'm going to do some more temporary, almost permanent securing of cables, and then when we come back on, I will give you an overview of how I secured everything for the most part before we do the final touches. We'll install the hard drives, we'll connect the hard drives up, and then we will power on and keep our fingers crossed that everything's going to play nice. So I will be back in a few. Alright, so I've done some securing. I've connected the DVD drive, and I've done some securing of the cables out of the power supply down there. As you can see, everything is nice, neat, orderly to provide optimum airflow. Our back panel, 2 graphics cards, audio card, and our back panel. And then on the back side is where the entire mess is. You can see our electrical tape backing. It's good to do it all on the back side, that way everything's nice and hidden. So what we're going to do is we're going to install the hard drives. We are going to connect the cables up for the hard drives, and then we're going to finish our cable management, and then we will be ready to boot it. So let me set this camera up, back up here for a second, while I grab the hard drives. Alright, like I said, for this we're using 2 Western Digital Enterprise Storage Velociraptor 10,000 RPM drives. I've labeled the drives when I pulled them out, just in case if I wanted to see if it would boot like this. I don't really want to go through the hassle of having it blue screen crash and all that. And like I said, I was having issues with the Windows XP Media Center Edition 2005 operating system. It kept saying it wasn't activated even though it was, and I'd have to go through this whole hassle of trying to trick it into realizing it was activated before I could get in and actually do anything. So I'm going to use a known good copy of Windows XP Professional that I've got on a couple other machines. I know the disk works. I know the product key. I've got a couple product keys for it. I've already loaded the product key, updated the product key to the disk, so we won't go through the actual activation sequence. It's a pre-activated copy that I just reloaded a new product key into that I have. And this one, the drive storage, is simple. It's right here. You slide and click in place. There's drive 0, drive 1, and drive 2 is an empty slot because I've only got 2 drives in it for the moment. That's all I seem to need. Alright, and then we will go over to the back side. Give a quick lighted view of them. Nice, neat, orderly storage. Alright, and then my light. Here on the back side, you can see we've got our access to plug in our power and SATA, which I will do right now. See if I can get. I want to check, make sure we plug the SATA in the right orientation. They're keyed. Only fit one way. Alright. And then what we'll do is we'll tuck, when I do my cable management, tuck them up and out of the way, as well as when I do for the power. Again, you want to make sure you've got the keying the right way. Power for 1, and power for 2. Alright, all that I've got left to do is to tidy up this and run the connections for the Molex that I need. Make sure I plug in this one and the controller for the RGB. And then I'm not going to put any panels on just yet. We will do our test. Power up and install with everything open, that way I can make sure everything works, and then we will close up the case, wipe all our fingerprints and that off the case, and I will do another overview video of the final one. Alright, so stay tuned while I work on that cable management to make everything nice and get set up to run our install. Alright, all the cable management is mostly done. I've got it set up to power on, and I guess let's just see what happens when we power it straight on without trying to reinstall, if it'll actually boot or if it'll crash. Let's see. Well, that's not a good sign. Slightly better sign than the last board, but it's still giving me the FF fault. But I do have the light indicating memory, unlike on the last one, and the power. So let's power it down and see. If you see, I've got the one blue light, which means board's in standby. And then if we power it on again, I've got a green light, which you can see, and you can kind of see the orange light back there, and the fault code of FF. So what I'm going to do is, I'm actually wondering if the audio card is being the issue, being that I wasn't having it working. I'm going to pull that out and see. I'll do a few tests off camera, and then once I get it up and working, I will come back on and we will continue.